Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Last episode, we discussed the rape and murder of Sharon Wilcoxson and the initial investigation leading up to the DNA hit and arrest. This episode, we'll talk about the building of the case, the investigation through the court process, and the result of the trial.
He was charged with murder. He was also, we had special circumstances that the rape was, there was a number of them. Special circumstances means that person is eligible for the death penalty. And so there was a burglary, there was the rape, and then there's also the fact that he had another murder conviction qualified him for the death penalty. So because it was potentially a capital case. So, it took a long time in part because of that.
This is now an active case. Ron, I'd like to bring you in now, working cold cases in 2008.
I came over and started working cold cases in 2008. Now, Anne Marie had already had this case up and going through the court process, which is, in this particular case, took about 5 or 6 years.
6 years, yeah, not more.
And I look at my notebook getting ready for this, and I realize, on this such and such a date of 2008, it was October around there, Anne Marie says, hey, I need some help for following up. And that's when I get involved in this. And then, of course, I start reading the file and everything to get ready. And Anne Marie had a very nice, long list for me.
So what did your work involve in on the case?
It's interesting, having worked homicide for 10 years and always being rushed. And then you come over here, and he's doing case preparation is not entirely different, but it's nice because you do get to spend some time on things. Anne Marie will give me a list of 30 things, and number 2 might take you a week. And this was one of those cases. Some of the things Ray mentioned that Sharon's purse was taken. Well, it was taken. It was found later on the side of a road. And pictures were torn, and other pictures of friends were left just out on the road. Well, I spent half a week going to, El Camino and Miraloma High School, trying to look through yearbooks and see who was involved. Well, I never had that kind of time when I worked at the sheriff's department. And you begin to do case preparation, whatever Anne Marie wants you to do, or whoever the DA is. But more importantly, and I've found over the years, working with these DNA cases, the DA's got to present all this stuff to a jury. And DNA, I'm no genius, but it's really a lot about numbers and possibilities and non-possibilities. But you need a story. So I've always talked to whoever I work on the cases with, you got to have a story. And it's the story that makes things horrible, like Sharon being so young, and also makes the course of the investigation more memorable to people sitting in the jury. Because people in the jury, all they know about is what they've seen on TV and over. And now all of a sudden this DA is going to come and just throw a bunch of numbers at me. It's got to make sense. And the DNA is the best thing we have going, but you still have to you got to wrap that package. And so a lot of what I did was helping Anne Marie wrap a nice package.
The thing about cold cases, and that Ron mentions, the jury learns stuff on TV. And the thing about cold cases that people that are fascinating in another way, but are challenging for us in law enforcement is that the jury of today is looking at a case that they expect to be investigated today, yet they were investigated 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so we have to try to put together a case from the 70s in 2002 timeframe. And so we've seen cold cases where, you got to go out and what did the area even look like in 1978? Because now we're living in 2002. How do we find photographs from that time? How do you find the people that were there? Are those witnesses still around? Are they alive? Are they competent to testify? So we have many of those things we have to overcome. Sometimes challenge. The cold cases are fascinating, but they can be even extraordinarily challenging because, like Ron mentions, you got to put this case together. Well, the pathologist who did this autopsy, I think, was Dr. Rooney.
Yep.
And Dr. Rooney, Ray will remember Dr. Rooney. He's a legend in his own mind. He's deceased now. But at the time, I think of this when the case finally went forward, he's probably in his 80s. And so we have to, it's not just one thing to say, oh, is DNA matched? We have to prove how we collected that evidence. And so if you have Dr. Rooney if he's not here, I can't remember. I think he was alive at the time we arrested this guy. But we have to figure out ways, how do we, what we call lay the foundation? How do we show the judge or the jury that the DNA that was collected from Sharon's body was done in an appropriate manner and that it is, in fact, we call what the chain of custody is. So Ron's work and a lot of this is building that chain of custody.
So how long, Ron, did your investigation, though, go on? What was the timeline of the work that you had to do?
I had about, 5 or 6 months, and I never actually finished all of the list before we, came to a resolution. And one of the things that Anne Marie brought up is finding people. And Anne Marie will probably tell you, sadly, the DNA is fantastic, but you cannot get it into evidence unless you can figure out who picked it up or who was holding it or who was watching it. And Anne Marie will tell you, sadly, we've had to drop a couple cases that we had hits on. Correct? I think they got refused. Yeah.
If you have a witness that's deceased and you have no other way, so like hypothetically, if you had let's say you had an autopsy and ideally you want the pathologist who literally collected the swab from the body. And if you don't have the pathologist, sometimes there's somebody that's in the room, the pathology assistant. So as long as you have someone there that says, oh yeah, I recognize Dr. Rooney's handwriting. This is his standard practice. He would do this and this and this. And Ray's probably been to hundreds of autopsies. And so if he was standing in the room at the autopsy, Dr. Rooney is no longer here, then he might be able to. But that's where we get into the challenges of cold cases sometimes.
Before you leave DNA, I just, from a detective's perspective, it's probably the most paramount important technology that ever occurred for two reasons. One reason, I think, that we had a lot of high-profile cases back then, we would generate lots of leads, lots of good, viable suspects. If we had technology that could actually eliminate some of those people, we would have been far more efficient. And incidentally, Olli George was my very first murder.
1976.
Yeah.
She was a young college kid. And honestly, that's another podcast, but it's just a fascinating case that he probably knew and suspected who it was, but never had the evidence. And then all of a sudden.
That's another thing, too, that sometimes they make a cold case hit and I would hear about, and my God, that's the guy we kept talking to all the time, Yeah. We had strong feelings about him. We were right on the right track. And so often you get off on the wrong track sometimes because all the information really points to this person and for one reason or another, but you can't eliminate it and he just stays there as kind of a sore in your investigation all the time. And of course, nobody was walking around with cell phones and other things taking pictures. So we were kind of in the low-tech, knock on doors and solve cases. And DNA would have been a huge boost to what we were doing and tried to do.
And it's great that it's still working for cold cases. It can be used now, even though it's, many decades later. Anne Marie, tell us what happened with the case.
So Mr. Thomas was charged with the murder in 2002. Obviously, he had a lawyer. He had somebody from the public defender's office. He also had a secondary attorney. So anytime somebody's facing a capital punishment, you get a second lawyer. And sometimes when there's DNA, you might even have a third lawyer. So it went through the court process. In our county in Sacramento, and Ron can probably attest to this, is that, and especially Linda, because she went to countless court proceedings, it takes a long time for a homicide to work itself through the system. And that's because, one, it's the most serious thing you can charge somebody with, right? You're going to take somebody's liberty away from them, likely for the rest of their lives. And so his lawyer has a right to be prepared. So while Ray had this case and Ron had this case, and we'd worked on this case for a long time, Mr. Thomas's lawyer has the same right to be prepared. And so it took a long period of time. And then during the court process, in order for somebody to face charges, you have to be what we call competent to stand trial, meaning that you have to understand the nature of the proceedings. You got to understand that what you're charged with and how you can help your lawyers and all that. So there was long periods of time where I would say Mr. Thomas, he had to go off and be what we call restored to competency. So where he knew what the proceedings were like. And so that just the whole process took a long time. It actually took, I think my notes are something to the effect of a few years to get it to what we call a preliminary hearing. So in all criminal cases in California, if we charge somebody with a felony, we have one major proceeding where we have to prove to the judge that there's sufficient evidence to make that person stand trial. I'm sure Ray has done hundreds, if not thousands, of preliminary hearings, as well as Ron, where you call in witnesses. And so we did a preliminary hearing in 2005. So it took a while. So then all along the way, so he was held, what we call held to answer, ordered to stand trial. And then at some point in probably late 2008, I think it was 2009, his attorneys asked if we would consider letting him plead to life without the possibility of parole. From my perspective, horrific crime, clearly a kind of case that could warrant the death penalty. However, given some of the nuances of the case and some of the issues we had, after much discussion with the district attorney here, Jan Scully, Linda and her family, we felt that what we call LWOP, life without parole, would be appropriate because we wanted to be sure he would never get out to harm anybody again. And I never say closure for victims, but I do at least say some resolution for her and her family. So,
yeah, I can honestly say, my sister and I, it was just my sister Tina and I that showed up in the courtroom that day in January, and we were just stunned that this was happening. We just couldn't believe it, and it was not a lot of fanfare, we just went into the courtroom and the judge came out and he came out, I think his attorneys, and Anne Marie was there, and the plea was entered, and that was that. And I remember looking at my sister, and we both we didn't know what to do. We just hugged each other. We just thought, this is not expected, but it was wonderful. But we were still sort of in this weird, sort of a shocked kind of thing. As we process that later, and I said it in my statement to the court, I'm so grateful because we didn't have to go through all of the trial and everything that was going to come out because of that, especially knowing now what we knew about her murder and her rape. And I can tell you, too, that the man that took her life was, he was crazy and, maybe not crazy mentally, he knew what he did, but he was awful. He was a really awful man. I wished that my path never crossed his, but, after he was sentenced and we went through all of that, I remember someone calling me, I don't know if it was from probation or whoever it was, that they had some evidence things from way back. Did I want them to come pick them up? I said, no. Would you like to know where Mr. Thomas goes, which prison? And I said, no. Do you want to know when he dies? No. I don't need to know any of it. I'm fine. I'm good.
As long as he remains in prison,
yep.
Right?
And he's not going to hurt anybody else.
Ray, what was your reaction to the result of this case?
so surprised. Then, not the first one, of course, but after Olli George, I was elated that here was this old case that the hardest part of retiring is leaving these unsolved behind you. That this first time I ever went to a murder was solved. And then we have this case, and there were some others. And of course, the really big one, it was just amazing to me. And I think back to how we used to investigate murders, and if we had just one little thing like that, how things may have been different. And I couldn't be more surprised and more happy or just elated. And in some of these cases they saw, we actually were on the right path also.
So before we started the podcast, Linda and Ray, you both had said that it had been about 40 years since you've seen each other.
Yeah. Long time.
Long time.
Anne Marie, how do you feel about this case?
I think I feel this way similar to how I feel about other cold cases. Whether it's a rape or whether it's a rape murder, is, people like Linda and her family, they're waiting. There's hundreds of people out there still waiting. And I remember one time on another case where a rape victim had said to me, I just want to know that the guy standing in front of me at the grocery store is not the guy that did this.
Yeah.
And that's just it's that unknown. And I feel, you've got these legends like Ray that work their tails off. And then we've got the brainiacs over here like Ron, who understand where we are now with technology. And we are in the greatest era now, not just because of forensic DNA, but now we got this genealogy stuff. We have the greatest era now where we can bring those answers to families. And, it's sitting here listening to Linda. I've known her for a long time, but the pain she feels today is very raw from 40 years ago. And you realize, people forget that. And it's easy to sit there and make big policies and talk about this. But if you don't know the facts and you don't know the families, and you don't hear their pain, you shouldn't, we can't make big decisions unless we understand all sides of the story. So for me, DNA is the greatest tool ever. No question about it, to find the truth.
Linda, what are your thoughts on DNA and how it was used in Sharon's case, and what did that provide your family?
Well, again, just watching as that unfolded as I grew up, and, I was always interested sort of in the news and crime, and like Anne Marie had said about, not being in the grocery store and thinking the guy in front of me had done it, or my family thinking that my sister's longtime boyfriend had done it. Knowing that technology, you have a hit and you can't deny it. It's a sure bet. I remember also working with Bruce Harrington on Prop 69 and going to the Capitol and speaking in behalf of that, because that's how strongly I feel that this is so important. And all these things are happening now because of it, that they have to give their sample if they're arrested for a felony. That changes lives. And for us, it was the closure that we needed. We as a family. I remember in the 80s, I moved back home from Lake Tahoe, and I've always sort of been taking care of my family. And I remember going to the sheriff's department and trying to, I think I met with you before, talked to Officer Reed a couple times. And they would say, we got this guy, he liked knives. He had, we really think it was probably him. But you just second guess it. And it's really unfortunate, because I believed him, but I didn't really know. And so when they had the DNA, even though I found out the circumstances that they collected it, going to the lab too and seeing all the rape kits that are there waiting to be processed, and what's going to be happening in our future, it's life-changing. And it does settle you down. It really does. You know for sure.
Ray, Anne Marie, and Ron, what about this case stayed with you? And what do you think are some of the lasting changes that came out of this and other DNA type cases?
Well, this is one of the earlier ones that I had worked on and doing follow up on, and it gave me a better insight of what I have to do to get cases ready for the next DA, whoever has a case like this. It also showed me a little helplessness looking back at the guys like Ray Biondi and Stan Reed. They had Willie Thomas. That morning, more background on Willie. The detectives, when they first get there, the patrol guys are saying, hey, we stopped this guy down the street for acting for some bizarre behavior. And this is January 1st. They had taken him for a 5150 evaluation hold on December 22nd. And then Stan Reed sees him out there in the freezing cold, and Stan's spidey sense kind of goes, this isn't right. And he's got some unusual dialogue as far as, hey, maybe you'd like to search. And then Stan and Ray interviewed this guy 3 or 4 times. They gave him a lie detector test, which he passed. Wow. And so it's not until we get this DNA hit, or as Stan used to call it, a magic phone call, where it's cold for 40 years and all of a sudden the phone rings and we're up and running again, and we have something. So it is a lot of, I guess that's what it brings back to me. It's kind of dumb in that respect, and it's selfish on my part, but you're banging your head for years and years and working on something, and you don't know if you're ever going to get an answer, and then luckily you do. So it does make you feel a little helpless.
To me, it was standing out there in the cold and in the middle of the night, and we have this horrific murder, and I'm thinking, are we going to have another one of those female slayings that remain unsolved? Mr. Thomas hadn't come to our attention yet, but that was the first thing. I guess it was because it was dark. It was New Year's Eve, and we still had people shooting off firecrackers and other things, not knowing what was going on in the neighborhood yet. But it really worried me when we have the ability to really work on this case and generate some real viable suspects.
Linda, I'm going to close with you. So how are you and your family doing today? You talked about that you had some rough spots over the years.
Yeah, we did. We struggled. First, the loss of our father, and then our sister, and we did the best we could. It took years to honestly get our lives together and become productive adults. I had a child in 1985 when I was 29, and that changed my life. My husband and I had been together for a long time. He and I actually were not dating at the time this all happened, but we'd been together for a long time, and we married, and we raised our son, and became very close with our church community. We've both served in positions there that have helped us to understand, how important family is, and that we honestly believe we'll see our family again someday. We believe that truly. My brother, Charlie, is doing really well. He's married and he lives in Portland. He has 2 children, a boy and a girl, and he's doing well. He's got a great job, and he had a hard time with this too. He was the youngest. And then my sister Tina has, we've always just been there together through all of this. And she still lives in Rancho Cordova with her partner. They're doing great. Bonnie has been a great support to us. And my sister just changed careers. She's a bus driver now for Folsom Cordova, working with special ed kids, and she just loves it. It's just nice to have the closure. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read just a little bit from the statement that I read in the court. I said, so now 6.5. And I should start with that. At the beginning, I thanked you and Officer Reed and Anne Marie and everybody who has been involved. But towards the end, so now 6.5 years after Mr. Thomas was arrested and brought to Sacramento, here we are. I have to say that I appreciate his guilty plea. Finally, that was the right thing to do. No trial, no more details, no more trauma for our family. We know that the laws of this country take care of people who take a life. They spend the rest of their lives in prison. They die in prison. Then when they leave this life, God takes care of the rest. Now this day, our family takes our lives back. We rest. That was really important. We rest. We celebrate the kind, gentle, beautiful, virtuous young woman that Sharon was. We remember her sweet spirit and feel her love all around us. Mr. Thomas has taken Sharon physically away from us, but her sweet, tender spirit is forever in our hearts. And I said, Your Honor, we love each other, we support each other, and we choose to live peaceful, happy lives. It is exactly what Sharon expects of us.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
I think that's a great place to close unless anybody has anything else.
I just don't want to miss this opportunity. We're lucky enough to get Ray here. And please, if anybody is interested in all of murders in Sacramento County in general, Ray worked from like 76 to 93. So I just missed him. There's a 2-year window. And he worked over about 500 cases. And during that time, I have to say, was a fascinating time in Sacramento County. Fascinating, not good, but fascinating, the number of different murders we had. And Ray's written 2 books, one on the Dracula killer, on Richard Chase.
Richard Chase.
And he wrote another one called All Our Father's Sins, I believe, on Roy
Riggins.
Gallegos?
Yeah, Ray Gallegos. Thank you. And it was
Ronald.
just a
Ronald.
Gallegos.
Yeah.
And it's just a odd, fascinating time. And Ray was there for all of it. And so all you have to do is just Google Ray. There's another podcast that he was on that talked about the Richard Chase murders. But the knowledge that he has, just on the way over here, he was telling me about, hey, did you look into this guy? And I'm trying to drive and with my knee and right names down because there's a institutional knowledge now that goes through the sheriff's department, through the police department, through all these different agencies, even through this office. And it's gone, and you're just trying to pick somebody's brain. And so I just wanted everybody to know that about Ray. And also, I'd never met Linda before. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting, and I don't know if these microphones pick it up, but you listen to somebody's voice, and she is still deeply affected on all this.
Yeah.
And you know, I've worked cases like this, and sometimes you don't always meet the victims or the victims, obviously not the victims, but the victims' families. And I don't always get to see the impact that it has on them. So it's interesting for me just as an observer to see, my gosh, this completely changed somebody's life and many lives. So thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Glad I'm here.
I thank everybody, but especially Linda, for sharing your story. And thanks, Ron, for mentioning that. On our podcast show notes page, I will have information on Ray's books, and we'll also have a beautiful picture of Sharon on that webpage as well.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
everybody.
the compliment. Ray, I'm good. Ron.
Thank you, everybody. Join us for our next episode when we talk about how to keep our kids safe online and our internet social media safety program called iSmart.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.